Hey, Matt.
Yes, Ryan.
There is a light that never goes out.
And which light would that be?
It's a problem light for me, and it's actually kind of driving up my electrical bill, and it's driving me insane. I can't figure it out.
The holidays will do that to you.
And welcome back, everybody. This is a podcast called Hey, Listen to This, and it's hosted by two hosts that are good friends that, every week we pick an album and we essentially dissect the album track by track. He is Matthew Durzik.
And he is Ryan Kearns.
I love how we just turned the tables there. I was just like, I've been wanting to do that for a little bit now, and I was just like, this is the prime opportunity to do it. So, the album that we are dissecting today, it is The Queen is Dead by the Smiths, released in 1986. Arguably, probably the most critically, and I would even say from like a fan standpoint, acclaimed album by the Smiths, which is kind of interesting because if I'm not mistaken, this is one of the last albums that they released, and this is playing in this album selection is playing into the theme that we have going on for the month of January. Which, Matt, you want to tell everybody what that theme is?
Yes. I was the one who twisted the tables throughout the whole month, where Ryan would have to pick albums that were before the year 2000, and I would have to pick albums after the year 2000 to sort of switch things up from the way things have been going for pretty much the entirety of the podcast, with a couple exceptions.
Yeah. I'm actually kind of glad that you did twist the tables, even though you kind of did throw off the groove that I had going on in my master plan. But we will resume that evil master plan in the month of February. But I digress. So I love how this gave me an opportunity to really focus in on the Smiths, because there's another evil master plan I have involving this album and another album that I'm glad that I can actually unveil that evil master plan. I have a lot of evil master plans, man. I can't help it.
Yeah, I get that. I'm getting a little scared, but that's okay.
Hey, it's okay, man. New year, new me, man.
Right. Or is it?
So, without further ado, you ready to dive into this album, man?
Let's dive into The Queen is Dead, and let's start with The Queen is Dead.
So, The Queen is Dead, the title track off the album, it begins in a very interesting fashion. Whenever I did first spin it, the production quality on this album, I know it was released in 1986, and I can't expect it to have the same, post-2000, production, but it's like a sample that I could not make out for the life of me. I know it sounded like a sea shanty, so due to the research that I was able to find, the sample that is used to open up this album, it's a music hall song called Take Me Back to Dear Old Lighty. And this song was written for a play about three soldiers returning to Blighty, a.k.a. Britain.
Yes, and again, this was a trend that a lot of different artists were doing roughly around the same time. I know, for example, right off the top of my head, I know Queen did it with Brighton Rock, where they had this sort of calliope carousel sound at the start of the song that came from a completely different sound quality. Peter Gabriel in 1980, he did it with Biko and did a African Chant before getting into that song. So this is very much of its time, as is the rest of the song, really, because this is a driving track, very new wavy. Guitarist Johnny Marr really drives the band into overdrive, and of course Morrissey, the lead singer of the Smiths, starts singing in his usual glossy tone about what it means to be British and what it means to be alone and why he hates both.
So, before we even go further into the album and this track specifically, what is your opinion about Morrissey's vocals? Because even before I got into the Smiths, like, objectively, I knew that they were a little bit polarizing because either people loved them or loved the vocals or they hated it. And I'll be honest with you, before diving into this album, I was kind of in the camp of like, oh, those are some weird vocals, man.
They are weird vocals, but I don't think they're bad vocals. At the very worst, they might be wrong vocals in a sense. You know, like if you sang, like let's say you have somebody like Luciano Pavarotti, and he's singing, you know, Ides Re or something like that. I know I probably butchered the name of it. Even like let's say a simpler tune, not Disarray, but "Oh Christmas Tree," and he sings "Oh Christmas Tree" with a lush, beautiful backing by the British Philharmonic Orchestra, which probably doesn't exist, but I'm going to go with it. Now that would sound appropriate if he sang the same exact way as he would for the Philharmonic, as he would for, let's say, the backing band of Lynyrd Skynyrd. It wouldn't quite mesh as well. And there are a few moments on this album in particular, and we'll get to them, where the vocals are good, but they feel a little mismatched. And then the other part of it is that the production on some of the tracks does him no justice and does the band no justice as well.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. Like, I will say, like, you know, even upon further reflection, so I'm gonna just peel back the curtain, Matt, a little bit here. This is our second attempt at recording this specific episode, and the reason why it's our second attempt is that after we did our first attempt, yours truly went to go bounce my track over to Matt, who does our edits for us, and I realized, oh, it stopped recording. What is going on? Lo and behold, like, for the moment I connected my earbuds to start the episode, like, it just paused the whole recording. So, yeah, I'm a little bit upset about that, but I digress. It's given me a chance to further reflect on the album and formulate a little bit more of a sharper opinion, so I'm kind of grateful for that.
Yeah, and again, you know, that stuff happens. Technology is not necessarily your friend sometimes, and every once in a while, those things tend to happen. But yeah, going back to Morrissey's vocals, on this particular track, they work just fine, because you can hear what he's saying, you can understand what he's coming from, and the one appropriate feature of his vocals, especially on a song like this, is that there's definitely a biting tone to it. Like, the fact that it's so finesse presents this air of, oh, I'm very stylish, I'm debonair, I'm better than you. And that's good for this track because he's basically saying, I'm better than all of Britain. Or at least better than the British monarchy.
Yeah. I feel like this, certainly like this track right here is the most, like, you know, punk rock out of all of the tracks off this album. And I maybe would have to take a look at the rest of their discography, which, I mean, after listening to this album, I wouldn't be opposed to doing so, but it might be the most punk rock that the Smiths have ever gotten, because, like, it's very forward, it's very direct, and it's taking aim at, like, you know, literally the government. So, like, there's a lot of themes in there that, you know, drive home that punk rock feel.
It's a solid song to start the album. It's a good track. However, I would disagree with you on the fact that it's the most punk track on the album, because I think that title goes to our next track on the album. There's the transition in the one and only Frankly Mr. Shankly. It doesn't sound as punk, but I would say the words are just as, if not more punk than The Queen is Dead.
Well, yeah, I would, I can subscribe to that notion. I was more talking from, like, a sonic tapestry, but, like, yeah. But, even at the, so, anyways, yeah, Frankly, Mr. Shankly. So, a funny story about this track here. This song is directly about Jeff Travis, who was the head of Rough Trade Records. That was the label that the Smiths were signed to at the time during the recording of this album. And let's just say, frankly, the relationship between the Smiths and Jeff Travis was not going so well at this time.
No, not at all. And the song bears that notion pretty bluntly. He talks about how he is going to quit his position and make it big in music, which is to imply that he hadn't before, which is a pretty decent dig at the boss of your music band. I love how direct Morrissey is with the lyrics here. I think they're poetic. I think they're fantastic. A lot of people, and this would be kind of one of those situations where he could have been very poet laureate and gone and said, you very much in the same way. Like another song that reminds me of is the song that kicks off Queen's Night at the Opera called Death on Two Legs, which is also about a lead singer's very angry resentment towards the music industry. This song's very much like that, except it's a bit jauntier in a more folky sense. I had said on the previous recording, I'll say it again, that it reminded me a little bit of Come On Eileen in a musical sense, but the lyrics, again, are so direct. He could have said, you're a big dog on a leash, you're an overgrown schoolboy, let me tan your hide, like Freddie Mercury did, but no, he just says, yeah, I think you're a giant pain in the ass, which is very welcomed and refreshing to hear, because when I heard this song, I had for the first and second time, I had no idea that it was directly about Jeff Travis. I just thought it was Morrissey painting the picture of a guy who's just wanting to quit his job, which he was, but I felt the way he wrote it, it could have been about anybody wanting to quit their job.
Yeah, and that gives way to, the artistic and compositional capabilities of the Smiths, where they can write such a direct track, but people can take multiple meanings off of it. And, yeah, excellent track, man. And what I will also say, a couple more notes about Mr. Shankly here, is it's a completely different... if you were to play me this track outside of any context of, any Smith songs, and you would tell me, at least without hearing the vocals, that, hey, this is a Smith song, I would be like, oh, okay, because it does not sound like, the traditional, new wavy kind of stuff. And quite frankly, maybe The Queen is Dead would have that same kind of, hey, this doesn't sound like a new wavy, what I would think to be a Smith song. But, two different songs to kick off the album. The Queen is Dead is more punk rocky. Frankly, Mr. Shankly kind of has, a nice, upbeat feel. And I'm here for it. I almost felt like, again, it maybe took some influences, at least, instrumentally from, reggae music, which is kind of weird for me to say, and I don't know if you would agree with that.
I kind of see where you're going with that. I don't completely disagree. I would say more like a Celtic influence, like maybe they were listening to Fairport Convention, or they rented a time machine and listened to the Dropkick Murphys. I don't know, but I would say that the folk version of the Smiths on here does seem a little unrecognizable, but I think it is a fantastic track. I think it's honestly my favorite track on the album.
Well, yeah, and it's not a bad track to have as your favorite track. A couple other notes to finish off this track, and then we can go on to I Know It's Over. So, One thing I picked up in my my multiple spins of this track here is that this is such a brutal, hilarious song that really shows Morrissey's style, and it's more of a sophisticated, like, screw you, man kind of style, and especially with the lyrics. But sometimes I feel more fulfilled making Christmas cards with the mentally ill, and the way that Morrissey sings that mentally ill, like, it's absolutely hilarious because you can just see him being like such a sassy man with that.
Absolutely agreed. And again, we talk about when his vocals become appropriate. This is very appropriate for him to be as smug and as smirk as he is, to tell somebody off. It works perfectly on this track.
So, ready to move on to I Know It's Over?
Let's do it.
Alright, so I Know It's Over. We start to get into the portions of the album that if you were to tell me, hey, this is a Smiths track, I would be like, oh, yeah, makes sense. Like, we have this new wavy kind of slow feel, and like, we have Morrissey being a very sad boy. Like, yeah, I can definitely see this being a more straightforward Smiths track here.
Yeah, and I agree with that notion in a sense, although the one thing about this track that kind of turned me off, and I'll say this up front, I think this is a solid track. I think the backing band, the rest of the Smiths, do a very good job. I think the bass line is good, the groove is good. It's an instrumental track. It would make nice mood music for various activities. But this is the first time on the album that I had a little bit of a criticism because, especially coming off of two very punchy, stylistic tracks like The Queen is Dead and Frankly Mr. Shankly from a perspective of, oh, I'm better than you, now we see Morrissey turning into a vulnerable position. He's realizing that he's lonely and he doesn't like it, and he wrote this song about it, which it sounds good, but it also sounds... This is where his vocal trying to purvey any sense of vulnerability and sympathy doesn't quite work as well as it did on the first two tracks.
I would respectfully disagree with you. I maybe agree to disagree on this, but I feel like his vocals in this specific track and this style, I have no issue with them because it almost feels like, again, I could be completely wrong with this, but again, this is the way I walked away from this specific track here. Like, the syrupiness of Morrissey's vocals, like, it really kind of gives way into this idea of, like, heartbreak. And even, like, with the repetition of the lyric, "Oh mother, I can feel the soil falling over my head." It almost, you can feel him crying in that. Again, I agree to disagree. Like, I can definitely see your point, but this is where my mind's at.
Yeah, I mean, that is the one saving grace here, is that the lyrics, like you say, are very poetic. They are strong in its imagery, and I do think this is only a bad song if you think about it. And when I say think about it, I mean overthink it like someone like me would do. Because if you're just grooving along to it, it's a solid track. If you get hooked by the lyrics that you mentioned, Ryan, you might think, oh, this is a really good track. But again, it just is it's almost too contrasting to the first two tracks. I'm not saying it's a bad track by any means, but it did land me into this position of, oh, I may not like this as much and I have to wonder why. But as far as the would I listen to this over anything off of Babel or Yeezus? Yeah, probably. Maybe with the exception of Bound 2 or one of my current favorites, Guilt Trip. But again, we're not here to compare other albums to albums. We're here to talk about The Queen is Dead.
Yeah. So, doing one last little note about I Know It's Over, and then we can move on to what I would actually feel like is a part two of, this track here. never had no one ever. So at one point, there's a set of lyrics where it seems like Morrissey's either having an inner dialogue or he's like, having a conversation with a former lover or just someone who, like, he's had an estranged relationship with. And the lyric set goes, "If you're so funny, then why are you on your own tonight? And if you're so clever, then why are you on your own tonight? And if you're so entertaining, then why are you on your own tonight? If you're so very good and if you're so very good looking, why do you sleep alone tonight?" And like that little dialogue section there, and the repetition of "Oh mother, I can feel the soil falling over my head," like it really, at least in my mindset, in my opinion, it really does encapsulate the feeling of like heartbreak, especially with the idea of like soil falling over your head, because like you really feel death at that point. And like that dialogue passage that I just mentioned there, like that basically that perfectly encapsulates the idea of like the feedback circle loop where like you just keep saying, hey, if all the good things you feel like you bring to the table, like if you are so good at this, then why are you by yourself? And I can really dig this track. It's not gonna make it into my tops of the album. Like I feel like out of the tracks so far, The Queen is Dead is definitely number 3 in my top 3. The other 2 are coming up here. Well, they're coming up. They're maybe not relatively shortly, but solid track. But yeah, I could dig it.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think in hindsight, I would probably put this in the top half of songs on this album. Maybe it would probably be on that line of being like a 5 or a 6, maybe even a 4 on a good day. Again, it's a solid track. It's just the first time I listened to it, I was like, oh, I had to start thinking about things, which meant I had to start overthinking about things. However, I think my overthinking is justified on this next track, which, if you are calling this a part 2 to the previous track we just talked about, is proof that sequels suck.
Yeah, so Never Had No One Ever. It almost seems like if the previous track, I Know It's Over, was a story, this part of the story is where the main character is just walking alone on the street at night and just looking at people's houses, but the song, it's not even entertaining. Like even through my respin of it, my re-opinion of this track here, like the one thing that I almost wanted to give it like a little bit of a credit for is the backing band, like the outside of Morrissey's vocals, like they're pretty. It's like I thought initially, like, oh hey, it's pretty tight, but it's only because they keep repeating that same kind of like motif that matches Morrissey's vocals, and like it's not a good motif, and it runs dry after a while.
I agree with that. It does get very repetitive, and not only is what's going on not interesting, particularly in the lyrics or the backing band. And again, this comes from my years working in radio and also listening to stuff like Steely Dan. This is just not very well produced. Like on the previous track, you may not agree with Morrissey's singing style, but at least you could hear what he's saying and at least you can vibe with how he's going. But it just feels like his vocals blend into the band. The band repeats itself over and over. It almost sounds like a live track without the live part. It's not lively. It's just recorded not great. So, yeah, not a great track. I mean, it does kind of keep up with the groove of what the previous track had done, but I really don't have much to add other than this is a very skippable track.
you talk about like the production being kind of crappy. I wanna test your knowledge and like if you caught something that until it was pointed out to me, I did not realize it. Did you catch at the very end of the track that Morrissey's whistling?
Um, I I'd forgotten that, but now you vaguely mentioned it, I do remember that he did whistle at the end of the track.
Yeah, so that kind of gets way to the imagery of like him walking alone at night, but like I don't know, it's just I'm gonna go with this imagery here, and sorry if this is gonna scar you forever in regards to this track here. Remember the movie The Room?
Yes.
You know the scene at the very end where Tommy Wiseau's character, I think his character's name is Johnny, is like, for lack of a better term, basically moaning and holding onto a red dress and just thinking about his former lover.
Yes.
I feel like this track is that. Like, it's Morrissey being like, oh, and I'm like, okay, dude, like, get out of here with this, like, this garbage here. Like, I don't want to hear you moan for, like, 2 to 3 to 5 minutes, man. Like, I don't got time for that, and it's not good, dude.
Yeah, although I'd probably rather listen to Morrissey do it than Tommy Wiseau.
Yeah, well, the Tommy Wiseau movie is a little bit more entertaining than this track, but
that's true.
I digress. We were going down a rabbit hole there. So, so that being said, ready to move on to Cemetery Gates?
Cemetery Gates. And this track definitely, it's a neat little track because it does a neat little trick where it keeps up with the sad theme through the lyrics, but musically changes back similar to what we had on Frankly Mr. Shankly. Very folksy, very upbeat, almost poppy in a sense. And again, it continues with this theme of being sad, but it's almost so ironic that it's fun, which in turn makes it very funny.
Yeah. So, in terms of top 3 tracks throughout the album, this is number 2 for me. And, like, it's every single time that it's on, and depending on the activity that I'm doing, which most of the time whenever I'm, like, listening to music, I'm either walking my dog or just doing work around the house. Like, I almost want to break out into a dance, which, like, gives away to, like, how awesome this track is. So, we talk about the contrast between the lyrical content and the compositional content. And so, on the lyrical side, this seems like it's Morrissey talking about his own mortality with lyrics that read, all those people, all those lives, where are they now? With a loves and hates and passions just like mine, they were born and then they lived and then they died. Seems so unfair. I want to cry. And, like, it's basically Morrissey walking through the cemetery at night and thinking, like, looking at headstones and being like, hey, this person, they were like me, they lived once and they had lives. Like, I'm going to be that person one day. So, like, I can get behind the lyrics and the track as a whole.
Oh, yeah, me too. And I think a lot of that goes to Johnny Marr and the backing band for just, again, providing such a fun, uplifting musical backing to whatever Morrissey's doing. It almost reminds me in a sense of Hitsville, UK by The Clash, which in itself is a rather dour song about the music industry presented in a upbeat, poppy way, which is meant for full irony and full, wait, what are they talking about? Why are they sad but also happy? Why is this happy but also sad type of vibe, which, again, I think is, for my money, more enjoyable than straight sadness as is scattered throughout this album. And again, that may be just a personal preference, but that's the personal preference I'm going with, and I'm half of this podcast, so I'm going with it.
There you go, man. And one other thing that I'm going to just say about this track, and then we can move on to Bigmouth Strikes Again. I absolutely love the set of lyrics that kind of gives way to, like, the relationship that Morrissey had with the press, and just the just how much news came out about him, and the way that the lyric set is written. The one line that I'm going to focus on, because there's always someone somewhere with a big nose who knows. Like, I love, like, how that set of lyrics ends with a big nose who knows, because, like, the two phrases sound alike. And, like, when we did our first recording of this episode here, I actually discovered that while reading the set of lyrics. I'm like, oh my goodness, that's such an excellent set of, like, and I love how that sounds. So I give Morrissey even more credit for writing lyrics that, like, flowed like that.
Oh yeah, yeah, and the theme that you talk about with beating on the press and making a fool out of them for trying to make a fool out of him, because as some of you may not be aware, back then and probably even now, still to this day, the UK tabloid press is ruthless. Like, they may not be as ruthless as American paparazzi was, like, the mid-aughts, but they're close. In most days, they're probably on that same level, if not worse. But again, Morrissey fought back, and he fights back again to start the sixth track on this album, as you said, Bigmouth Strikes Again.
Yeah, so Bigmouth Strikes Again was the second single off the album, and it kind of follows the same feeling of the previous track in terms of, like, at least a lighthearted approach. And, like, so when we were talking about Frankly Mixture Shankly, we were talking about, like, how, like, there's lyrics in there that absolutely show how brutally hilarious Morrissey can be at times. This like, the set of lyrics that I'm gonna, like, reference here, it goes, I'd like to smash every tooth in your head. Oh, sweetness. I was only joking when I said, by rights, you should be bludgeoned in your bed. And, like, when I heard that for the first time and I did, like, registered, I'm like, oh, okay, good sir.
Yeah, he was relentless on this track. And much like Cemetery Gates, it's very in the vein of, presenting these rather dry and harsh lyrics. And probably for the first time since, frankly, Mr. Shankly, do we go back to smug, arrogant Morrissey as opposed to debonair, sad Morrissey. And it very much feels like a track that sort of parallels The Queen is Dead in that regard, because Morrissey's being brash and the backup band is being very upbeat once again. Now, did I think this track was as good as Cemetery Gates? No, I didn't. But that doesn't mean it's not a solid track. And again, if you think, and then this is a track, I said, if you think too hard about the ballad following Frankly Mr. Shankly, you're probably not going to enjoy it as much. This is one where you can enjoy it whether or not you're paying attention. This is just a good driving song, and if you listen to it, you may appreciate it even more. So, yeah, I think like you hit it right on the head with the lyrics, talking about how the press is just very brutal, and how he wants to be very brutal towards the press. Again, I'm sure if he released that today, he would either be accused of being an edgelord or be taken very seriously and put in prison. But on this track, it just works. It just works.
If you talk about, like, if Morrissey were to release that set of lyrics nowadays, he would either be an edgelord or be set in prison. I feel like that's still Morrissey nowadays. Like, he does not give a crap about anything. Like, so peeling back the curtain here a little bit before we go into the Boy with the Thorn in his side. The way that I was drawn to this album specifically was I listened to a mega beefer of a two-parter episode of The Smiths' career from the podcast called Bandsplain. So it ended up being like maybe like a 4 or 5 hour experience for me, and that was a bit much. And like the host of that podcast, she constantly referenced like passages off of Morrissey's autobiography, and like the way that some of the passages read, it's absolutely hilarious. And maybe one day I would want to like read that because I feel like it would be a good time.
Oh yeah, yeah. I think reading Morrissey's words, just delving into his psyche, or at least what he presented as his psyche, would at the very least be entertaining.
Yeah. So moving on to the Boy with the Thorn in his side.
Yes. Track number 7 on The Queen is Dead, The Boy with a Thorn in His Side. And again, very much upbeat compared to some of the songs on side 1 or the first half of the album. Not as lyrically deep, though, as Bigmouth Strikes Again. It tends to get a little repetitive at times, and it's not bad. Again, if you're just listening to this album with your brain turned off, it's a solid track. And if you're listening hard enough, it'll probably still sound the same, because it feels very jammy, almost kind of like an REM track in a sense.
Yeah, I can get behind that. Like, one thing that I wasn't even, like, from my a little bit more of a further research I was able to do on this album and this track specifically, like, people saw this track as Morrissey having like almost like a murderous kind of intent with how he has such a desire to be loved and understood. And quite honestly, I mean, I might have to respin the track again to like discover that, but like, I don't know, this almost seems like it's still following in that same kind of like light feel like you mentioned, and like I don't get the sense of him being like having any sense of murderous desire, but it could be, I mean, I can get behind the lyric set, but this might go into the bucket of maybe like it's fine, it's okay, but like in terms of like the track listing as a whole, maybe not the the cream of the crop, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I would say this is towards the top of the bottom half in a sense. It's a solid track. It's fine, but there's really not much to say about it from an overall perspective of why this track is good or why this track is bad. It just kind of is, and it leans a little towards good because, again, the instrumental backing is pretty tight and pretty good.
Yeah. So this was actually the first single off the album, which, in my opinion, makes sense. I mean, so the singles were The Boy with the Thorn in His Side, Bigmouth Strikes Again, and then the big beefer of the song There Is a Light That Never Goes Out. And each track makes perfect sense of it being a single, and especially with like The Boy with the Thorn in His Side. Like if you think about like contextually where this album lands in the the timeline of the Smiths' discography, this was towards the end of their career, and like to introduce the album as a whole with Morrissey being like, I want to be loved and understood, it makes sense, man.
Yeah, it's a track that fits, and again, it's a solid single to start off with because again, it's upbeat and probably will land on the chart somewhere. I mean, and not to knock on the tracks I've liked so far, but you really can't put out The Queen is Dead as a single in the UK because because the Sex Pistols already tried that and it almost worked, but the BBC intervened and they did not get to number 1, and that was probably on purpose, but we'll tell that story at another date possibly.
Yeah. So, ready to move on to Vicar in a Tutu?
Vicar in a Tutu, yes. Now, this song, I gotta be honest with you, as we were starting to re-record this album, we were getting to this track, I was like, oh crap, I don't remember this song at all. But now that you mentioned the title of it, yes, I do. So thank you for that. This was sort of another tune that's a bit more folksy and jaunty in the sense of, frankly, Mr. Shankly or Symmetry Gates. But probably the weakest of the three, where I would say the lyrics here are a little too, I wouldn't say too poetic, because they are poetic and they are a solid set of imagery-laden pieces of words. Sure, let's go with it. Where Morrissey talks about, what if you put a vicar in a tutu, and sort of presented that irony to the church-listening folk who might be hearing this record off their gate, or perhaps to the people who might be opposed to the church, and to give them a bit of a laugh, in a sense. It's another solid track, but aside from the wordplay, which I'll let Ryan dive into a little bit more, not particularly up on my top tracks on this particular album.
I would say Vicar in a Tutu, after examining it a little bit further. Unfortunately, I'm going to say it's landing towards the bottom tracks off the album for me. So, my least favorite one is No One, Never Had No One Ever. I would say this is probably my, that's the worst song. There's a song coming up that's going to be the second worst song. This is the third worst song, so it's in the bottom three for me. And there's a specific reason why. And, I take issue with the production on this track here. I kind of love the old school country feel. It almost seems like this is something that Johnny Cash could easily, rip and, do back in the day. But it almost seems like Morrissey is singing from very far away from the microphone. This song would be instantly so much better if he would just get closer to it. The vocals are just it almost seems like he's I don't know. You know what I mean?
I know exactly what you mean. And that's the problem I had during bits and pieces of the first half of the album, particularly on Never Had No One Ever. Even a little bit on The Queen Is Dead, too. I was trying to listen, what is he saying? What's he trying to say there? And again, this was in 1986, so there was no excuse for this. We already had the likes of Steely Dan's Asia, or Christopher Cross's first album, or, heaven forbid, anything Quincy Jones got his hands on with Michael Jackson. Vocal production being as crystal clear as possible was a choice, and a choice that could be possible. And to do the opposite of that is also a choice. And you may say, oh, well, maybe they were screwed over by their producer. No, Morrissey, as I remember, is a co-producer of this album, so he made those choices too. And aside from that, again, the lyrics don't. I think the problem with the lyrics here is that they don't feel natural, and it almost feels like they're being a little too try hard and being funny in sort of a hardcore whimsical sense. And it's respectable to a certain degree, but not something I want to go back for.
Yeah. The lyrical content, I will at least say, I do appreciate the contrast that it is portrayed in this track, where they have this character that isn't a tutu, and then you have the traditional church folk, and it gives way to maybe the overall themes of this album, which talks about different classes, and hey, this guy's not strange, he wants to live life his own way. And I always give it that nod, but overall, I might even say this might move up in the worst rankings for me. Like after like even further like inspection, because at least no one ever like I don't know, like they're all crap songs in my opinion. So, but like the more I'm talking, the more I'm like, dude, I actually don't care for the song whatsoever, especially considering what comes next in the album.
True. I do love it moves up in the worst rankings. I guess that would be more move it down, but whatever. That's just splitting hairs.
So the next track is "There's a Light That Never Goes Out," and in terms of like Mount Rushmore of Smith songs, this track is probably like the first head on that mountain.
It's definitely on there. I don't know if it's the first head on there. I would probably pay deference to How Soon Is Now as far as like the top song on that Mount Rushmore, but this is definitely on there, and for good reason. It is a very good track. It is probably the most stereotypical sounding track as far as new wave goes, but that doesn't knock it. What really drives this song, though, aside from the driving backing of the band, is the lyrics by Morrissey, which are just phenomenal. Probably the most deep and dark romanticist lyrics, not just on the album, but probably throughout the entire catalog of new wave.
Yeah, and the awesome thing about this track here, like there's many different layers that I want to be able to dissect here. Maybe not entirely, not to the extent that I dissected I Am Trying to Break Your Heart, because I don't think I'm ever going to dissect a track that hardcore ever again. But, I mean, we'll see. But, like, so the whole track as a story and a theme, this sees Morrissey and the protagonist of this track just wanting to just escape and just drive away into the night. And there's actually, I don't know, some elements of... I might be reading into it a little bit hardcore, but at least from a stylistic standpoint, there are multiple references where Morrissey talks about, not having a home because he doesn't have one and he doesn't want to go home. And it almost feels like, there is friction and, there was, fundamental disagreements with the parental units and whoever, whoever the main character in the story is. And a lot of themes that came up in Morrissey's time in the Smiths is his sexuality, because they thought that he was a homosexual, and turns out Morrissey's just I just don't want to be with anybody, so and so, but yeah, I love the feeling of wanting to escape and just diving into just whatever the night's gonna take. I was there's even the biggest set of lyrics is and if a double-decker bus crashes into us, to die by your side is such a heavenly way to die. And it's basically saying I don't even care while we're driving down the road if somebody just totally T-bones us, because if I die by your side, I'm okay with that.
There is something rather transformative about hearing someone talk about love in that manner. Wanting to be in love and be in romance so hard that it takes you out of this life. Yeah. And there are very few songs like that. I know first one that comes to mind for me is Born to Run by Bruce Springsteen. You can also maybe throw Layla, a couple Motown songs in there, where it feels like the singer is equating being in love with trying to save their own lives and trying to save the lives of everybody around them. And obviously that's not what Morrissey is pleading for here, but it's in that same vein of equating love with life or romance with life. And that to reach that level of romantic nirvana is worth the ultimate sacrifice, which, again, just processed perfectly on this track. It's probably the best song on the album. It's not my favorite. I'm sticking with, frankly, Mr. Shankly, but I will at least say that from a objective perspective, it's the best.
This track here does line up in my favorite. It is my favorite off the album. So, like, my top three to, like, recap. There's Life That Never Goes Out, Cemetery Gates, and then The Queen Is Dead. But to wrap up discussion about this track here before we go into Some Girls Are Bigger Than Others, this is another moment where I really got into the... I really appreciated the opportunity to, like, revisit certain aspects of the album. And, like, one podcast that I listened to about this album as a whole, they referenced the fact that the last lyric that gets repeated a lot is there is a light that never goes out. And more, like, at least upon initial listens, I was just like, oh, well, hey, they're just riffing on the song title. Like, I didn't really think too much of it. But to further go along this path of escapism and, like, not wanting to be home and, like, just going out into the night, the whole there's a light that never goes out, that could be giving way to the idea of, like, this protagonist is just imagining everything in his head with this, because, and, like, he's never able to go out at night because he always has a light on his room, and that light never goes out.
Right, and it does make for a strong coda to end the song, and what should have been probably the end of the album, but it wasn't. We now have the end of the album with the aforementioned Some Girls Are Bigger Than Others. And I'll go ahead and take this one because you know how some bands like to do a song that's not theirs as a sound check? Where they get in the studio or they're ready for a live show, like they'll play something simple like Smoke on the Water, or the probably most famous one is during a intermission of two songs during Nirvana's famous Unplugged in New York. They just break out into Sweet Home Alabama for some stupid reason. That's kind of the vibe I get from this track. It's a very demo-ish, bonus track-ish song. Is it the worst song I've ever heard? No. I actually think the backing is pretty solid. It's pretty tight. But aside from that, it's really not too much of anything else. I mean, it's basically Morrissey talking about how some girls are bigger than others, which I thought was a face value remark until the first time we recorded this episode, where Ryan, you informed me of what it actually does mean.
Actually, I'm going to twist that original meaning there, because this is another instance where I'm very, very glad that I was able to revisit this album. But, like, for those of you who are like, well, I want to hear what the original thing was, the original take. So the original take, and it might have been a poor take on my part, but the whole concept of, like, some girls are bigger than others, like, it could be referring to, like, the size of, like, breast. But from that being said, like, I think, and this is what I'm going to stand with the take here, and it improves the song a little bit for me. Like, the whole concept of some girls are bigger than others, like, it's more talking about, again, classism, and, like, hey, some people are more important than others. And this is, like, the lyric set that kind of gives way to this is, from Ice Age to the Dull Age, there is but one concern I have just discovered. And yeah, like, there's not a whole lot here, and, like, it's not a bad track. It's just, it's extremely filler. The one thing I do not care for with this track, though, is just a weird fade out then fade in to start out the track there, because I'm like, okay, what was the point of that? Like, but it's a weird way to end the album. I like if this track were like in like, I don't know, let me just take a random like stab at it here. Like, if it would have been placed in between Never Had No One Ever and Cemetery Gates, like, I could have lived with that, because we were going from, like, you know, sad to sadder to, okay, coming back out of it, and then Cemetery Gates, where it's just like, lyrics are still sad, but it's a happy song.
I'm going to respectfully disagree with that notion. I understand where you're coming from. My problem is, if I had to hear this song after Never Had No One, it probably would have downgraded the album a lot for me, because it's just like, okay, that's one song I'm not as keen on, plus two in a row I don't like. So, and granted, not the worst track I've ever heard, but again, very filler, very let's just test our mics and guitars and see how we sound type of vibe.
Yeah. But, I mean, so let me give a quick, like, you know, bottom three ranking here before we give a rating and, like, you know, wrap up the rest of this episode. So, let's see. The worst track off the album for me, I'm going to still say Never Had No One Ever, because still that track as a whole is just not good. Then I would put Some Girls Are Bigger Than Others as the second worst track off the album. And, like, rounding out the bottom three is going to be Vicar and a Tutu. So, I don't want to totally crap on Vicar and a Tutu, because if Morrissey would just get closer to the microphone, it would have been a better track. So, that being said, you ready to give this album a big fat rating here?
Yeah, let's do it. And I will go first. Honestly, I thought it was a solid album. Again, there were some standout tracks that were really good. Some tracks that weren't as good, obviously. Because I agree, my bottom three is the same as yours. I would say I'd probably give this a solid 7.5.
Okay. So, originally, I did give this album a 7 out of 10 in the first recording of this episode here. I'm going to actually bump it up one notch here to an 8 out of 10. Mainly because, like, you know, upon further revisions of, like, you know, not revisions, but, like, you know, revisits of, like, specific tracks, maybe appreciate the album a little bit more. So, with your 7.5 and my 8, it gives the album an average rating for us as a 7.9 out of 10. So, I can get behind that.
Wait, hold on. Why is that a 7.9? That math doesn't math.
Wait, hold on.
Pretty sure that's a 7.75.
Yeah, don't... Well, hold on. Yeah, 7.75. I've had a day, man. I've been up since, like, you know, 1 a.m. So.
That's fair.
Yeah. But that being said, so 7.75 out of 10, which, honestly, much better than Babel for both of us. It seemed like we both got behind this a lot better. And so today I was like, as you know, but the listeners probably don't know, I was listening to the first draft of Babel, and there might have been a couple areas where I kind of was maybe a little harsher on Babel than I needed to be, and maybe it didn't deserve the 4 out of 10, but I'm sticking with the rating. I'm a man of my convictions.
Yeah, that's fair.
So, if people were to want next album recommendations, I'm gonna let you go from here.
Yeah, next album recommendation I would have is very much another indie rock album, because I think that Morrissey's voice is very much the godfather of the indie rock sound, in sort of his tone and clarity. I would say from 2011, it is Arcade Fire's The Suburbs, where Win Butler, in a more clear and concise manner, goes through different genres, in a sense, different tempos, and presents a similar picture of dealing with life in American suburbia as opposed to British suburbia. It's one of my all-time favorite albums, and I would say that's a good stepping stone of how proper mixing can do this formula very, very well.
So the album that I'm going to recommend is another indie rock album from the modern age. Shocker. But the album is by a band called The National, and the album is called Boxer, released in 2007. And there's a vocalist that, doesn't have a more traditional, vocal style, and the album as a whole explores loneliness and modern age, and what at the end of the day does encapsulate what we all should be striving for when it comes down to it. And I feel like it wraps up the the way that story concludes compared to The Queen is Dead here. It's a much stronger conclusion, and I would even say it's a much better album. But yeah, Boxer by The National, it would be an excellent next stepping stone from here for me. So that being said, Matt, where are we going next in our journey here?
So it's my turn to pick, and it's my turn to pick an album from the category of 2000 and onward, and I'm actually going to go as close as 2020. Or actually, I think it's 2019 is when this album was released. And I'm going to stick with the one, because I could have been that guy and changed my pick from the last recording, but I'm not going to do it, because I've already given this album a listen, and I'm going to give it another. It is When We Fall Asleep, Where Do We Go? By one Billie Eilish.
Awesome. It's going to be interesting to, dissect our first pop album. But that being said, do you have any other remarks about this episode before we send it out here?
One thing I will say is that since our last recording and this recording of the same episode, you have added something for those who are curious as to what songs they may want to listen to from these albums.
Oh, yeah. So I'm going to be dropping into our social media feeds. But we talk about big tracks off of albums that we really do appreciate. I decided to construct a Spotify playlist. So yeah, be looking for that whenever this episode drops. I think that would be a good way to share a playlist with everybody.
Yeah, it'll allow you to get inside the head of me and Ryan, or at least into the music library of what we've been talking about so far. Yeah. With a couple of exceptions. Thank you, Neil Young. Thank you, Joni Mitchell.
Yeah. All right, so that being said, if you made it this far into the episode, thank you for listening to another episode of Hey, Listen to This. The best way, if you like what you heard, and if you want to support the podcast, at this stage in our careers with podcasting, the best way that you can help support us is just share the show with a friend. Whatever you're listening to this on, YouTube, a traditional podcasting platform, rate, do all the positive actions, rate, subscribe, give a thumbs up, 5-star review, all the whole, the whole shebang there. If you're looking for us on any social media platforms, the tagline is TT Hey Listen. And if you want to write to us directly, we have an email at ttheylisten@gmail.com. And for the last time in this episode, he is Matthew Derzik.
He is Ryan Kearns.
And there is a light that never goes out.